Welcome back to Thinking for the Free. The political influence of left-wing ideologies and the disastrous migration policies prompted by them has led to a visible decline of some Western nations. The good news is that there's nothing unstoppable or irreversible about this decline. But one needs to realize and further analyze the problem in order to fuel pushback. In some of the videos on this channel, I would therefore like to explain the errors of left-wing German politics and policies to English-speaking audiences, namely as a particularly appalling cautionary tale. In other words, don't do what Germany did and does. In this spirit, we will now take a look at the German political party AfD, the Alternative for Germany. Left-wing German parties and media, as well as the current government, revile this party as right-wing extremist. And English-speaking language legacy media parrot this vilification without caring too much about the facts. I guess it's just too tempting and juicy to write about alleged Nazis in Germany. However, far from being right-wing extremists, the AfD is simply the only party in Germany that consistently criticizes the pernicious migration policies initiated by the former Chancellor Angela Merkel. In other words, the left, not only in Germany but also elsewhere, propagandistically defames opponents of open border policies and defenders of national interest as fascists or Nazis. The actual authoritarianism and anti-democratic sentiment, however, is to be found on the left's very own doorstep. Let us have a closer look. In Germany, the government is radical, not the allegedly undemocratic far-right opposition. I will now acquaint you with a few facts about Germany that sound as if they are taken from a tragic comedy about some dystopian future. Yet they are not. They describe Germany's present. For starters, the German government, for example through the State Secret Service, about which more later, in all seriousness tells the ethnocultural group that constitutes the vast majority of the state's citizens, namely the Germans, that it is impermissible to regulate migration in a way that would preserve the majority status of the Germans and German culture. Instead, the government allows the uncontrolled influx of hundreds of thousands, indeed of millions of migrants from groups among which the following types of individuals are massively overrepresented in comparison to Germany's indigenous population. Terrorists, knife and machete attackers, yes, you heard right, machete attackers, murderers, rapists, as well as anti-Semites and enemies of liberalism, democracy and women's rights. These facts are documented through official crime statistics, opinion polls, empirical studies, and an ever-growing number of news reports and videos of atrocious incidents. However, the government and its state-funded pseudo-NGOs call everyone a racist, Islamophobe, right-wing extremist, or even Nazi. Who dares to point out these statistical facts in the midst of a murder, terrorism, stabbing, rape and gang rape epidemic of unprecedented proportions? Even though the country's very own official police statistics of crimes in the context of migration clearly registers the exponential increase of such crimes. As well as, by the way, the fact that members of some migrant groups, the usual suspects, disproportionately commit them. Furthermore, the government generously supports illegal immigrants who have no business being in the country in the first place, to the extent that half, let me repeat that, half of the many billions of welfare support called citizens' money ironically goes not to citizens, but to foreigners, including to those disproportionately figuring in the crime statistics. But not enough with that. No, the government also actively sabotages efforts to deport illegal aliens, for example by financing NGOs who teach migrants all the dirty tricks they need to escape the law and deportation. And this generous help is even extended to illegal immigrants who have committed the most heinous criminal acts. No matter. In addition, the government, as different newspapers reported, appears to have been illegally advising its embassies to ignore visa requirements when it comes to the importation of certain groups, even though they pose a problem already. And to put the dot on the I, and here tragedy almost becomes comedy, on the rare fig leaf occasion, a mere handful of the thousands of murderers or rapists are indeed deported to their country of origin, and often they come back given the open borders, they get €1,000 as a departing gift. Wow! But if, and this is a point I'm getting at, a political party finally says enough of this and voters vote for it, the votes are being called undemocratic and calls for the party's isolation or even prohibition abound. That is Germany in the year 2026. Metaphorically a dystopian nightmare, and actually and unfortunately cold and hard reality. Post-colonial double standards and the allegedly extremist alternative for Germany. Now, if anything like what I have mentioned before happened, say, in an African or Arab country, and the migrants in question were white, professors and students of post-colonialism at universities like Berlin, Oxford or Princeton would celebrate the rise of this new party as a sign of hope and an act of resistance against a local government betraying its own population for the benefit of foreign colonizers. Yet given that this happens in Germany and the migrants aren't white, said party, the Alternative for Germany, is depicted as right-wing extremist, and its most charismatic representative, Björn Höcke, he's the leader of the AfD in the province of Thuringia, is ludicrously described as if he were almost a revenant of Adolf Hitler. By the way, if anything like this happened in an African or Arab country, Western journalists would hardly trust the respected governments to paint an accurate picture of the opposition. In the German case, however, Western journalists show little such reticence. In this case, they just happily believe what they are being told by a foreign government bad-mouthing its opposition. And an additional problem for foreign journalists is they often fail to appreciate the government ties of German organizations or the politically motivated manipulative character of certain statistics, especially when those statistics fit their own preferred narrative. Crime statistics in the context of uncontrolled immigration, rape and murder on the rise. To wit, recently, a number of influential English language newspapers, including the New York Times and The Guardian, have, relying on German police statistics, claimed that almost all anti-Semitic crimes in Germany are perpetrated by alleged far-right forces. What these newspapers fail to note, and perhaps don't know, however, is that the German Bundeskriminalamt, the BKA, it is roughly equivalent to the FBI, is the ultimate source of these statistics. But by default, it counts anti-Semitic acts as right-wing. And this, although it is meanwhile well known that the overwhelming majority of such acts in Germany are committed by Muslims. The government and the BKA do not even deny this anymore, but they still continue this manipulative counting practice. The reason for this is, of course, that the government is interested in selling right-wing extremism as the biggest threat, as it has done for years, while downplaying the dangers created by uncontrolled mass migration. These dangers are considerable. From 2015 to date, there have been at least 429 homicides and over 15,500 cases of rape or sexual assault involving at least one foreign suspect. This is my own calculation based on BKA statistics. Other researchers have come up with similar numbers. Among rapists with a German passport, German perpetrators with Muslim migration background are massively overrepresented. Gang rapes, now 2 per day, which is a 90% increase since 2015, are particularly popular, for example, among Afghans, Syrian and Iraqis, who also appear disproportionately in the murder and general rape statistics. Moreover, as the government itself had to disclose, politicians of the AfD, not of the other parties, are the main victims of political violence in Germany, namely violence emanating from the left. This is another fact rarely noted in foreign media, but then again, it also isn't noted by left-leaning or state-financed media in Germany. The opposition's extremism is proclaimed by an Office for the Protection of the Constitution that serves a government agenda. Of course, the AfD could still be a right-wing extremist party. However, in the German context, an extremist party is one that actively tries to undo the so-called liberal democratic basic order, in German, die freiheitlich-demokratische Grundordnung. Part of this basic order is not only democracy, which need not to be parliamentary democracy, but also respect for human dignity, which would be violated, for example, by treating certain races as having lesser worth than others. By the way, the mere stating that some races have lesser worth than others would not necessarily count as such unconstitutional treatment, but as an exercise of freedom of speech, which of course is increasingly trampled upon in Germany. Be that as it may, the German Verfassungsschutz, that is the domestic intelligence agency charged with the protection of the constitution, claims that the AfD is indeed extremist. And many on the left, including politicians from the governing parties, would even like to prohibit the party, a possibility the German constitution indeed provides for. However, neither in its federal nor in its provincial incarnations are these guardians of the constitution independent of the government. Rather, their presidents are political officers who can be discharged by the respective ministers of the interior, which are all members of parties opposing the AfD. So how objective can this guardian of the constitution possibly be? In addition, while there are parliamentary committees responsible for overseeing the work of these agencies, the other parties exclude members of the AD from seats on these committees, just by the way, as the unconstitutional exclude them from money for party foundations. In fact, in recent months, even critics from social democratic and decidedly anti-AfD quarters, as well as constitutional lawyers, have charged the alleged guardian of the constitution with degenerating into a kind of politically weaponized thought police. They did this not least due to the openly biased public statements of Thomas Haldenwang, the former president of the federal agency. The current president, by the way, does not, as critics have already noted, appear to be an improvement, but more of the same. Moreover, and meditate on this for a moment, in a paranoid turn of events that might well remind one of Stalin and Pol Pot, the agency has even started to gather material about its own former president, the predecessor of Haldenwang, Hans-Georg Maaßen. And it did so once Maaßen had announced the formation of his own party, the Werteunion, the Union of Values. Well, one could almost get the impression that the guiding principle is to keep the opposition small. Who needs more parties if we already have ruling parties and we are in them? Or as even a member of the left-wing party Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht stated in the context of a recent attack on freedom of speech by the Bavarian Verfassungsschutz, I quote, "Unfortunately, anyone who wants to defend fundamental rights now has to protect the Constitution from the Office for the Protection of the Constitution." Unquote. By the way, the agency backpedaled in at least that attack on freedom of speech, one of many, after being slapped with injunctions issued on behalf of several media outlets who felt libeled. The argumentative case for the AfD's extremism is construed and partisan. Thus, when it comes to the question of who is and who is not extremist in Germany, one is clearly ill-advised to simply take the word of the domestic intelligence service for it. Instead, one needs to look at the actual arguments and presumed evidence. These are rather thin, however. To wit, the central argument, as noted in the service's yearly reports, is that the AfD has a concept of the people that contradicts the German constitution. The agency even claims the AfD's concept is völkisch, that is a quite untranslatable German word. They do not explain what they mean by this, but according to the decisive German dictionary, the Duden, which in this context explicitly mentions National Socialism, a völkisch concept would conceive of a people as a race. However, the AfD does no such thing, nor does the agency even attempt to prove that it does. On the contrary, in his interview book, the already mentioned Björn Höcke rejects any such race-based concept as ludicrous. Thus, the use of the term völkisch by the Verfassungsschutz looks suspiciously like a rhetorical attempt to associate the AfD with the Nazis, whom, it might be worth mentioning, Höcke actually detests. It is true, though, that the AfD explicitly distinguishes the German people understood as the collective of all people who have German citizenship from the German people as an ethno-cultural group. And it would like to preserve the latter, especially through certain migration restrictions. Just, by the way, as Israeli and Japanese political parties would like to preserve the character of Israel and Japan as Jewish or Japanese states. Why should any ethno-cultural group, being the vast majority in its state, idly stand by in the face of mass migration, threatening both its majority status and its liberal democratic values. The guardians of the Constitution, however, appear to deem it unconstitutional not to idly stand by. But it clearly is not, and the ethnoculturally German founders of the Constitution would certainly agree. It is not unconstitutional nor immoral as long as such policies aimed at the preservation of one's own culture are pursued without the states discriminating against German citizens who are not also simultaneously members of the German ethnocultural group. By the way, the existence of a German ethnocultural group is actually recognized by the German Constitution itself, as well as by the Ministry of the Interior, which vows, I quote, to preserve and develop the ethnocultural identity of Germans abroad. Therefore, the following verdict by Dietrich Murswig, Professor Emeritus of Constitutional and Administrative Law at the University of Freiburg, seems at, I quote, through its reasoning, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution makes itself an instrument of the government. It defends the current immigration policy with this justification and serves to eliminate any opposition to it. Instead of protecting the Constitution, it is damaging democracy. How true? The red herring of Islamophobia. A further argument of the agencies that the AfD is anti-Islamic. This reproach is silly. After all, Germany is not an Islamic republic. Parties and citizens therefore can be as anti-Islamic as they please, without thereby acting against the Constitution. Of course, they must respect the religious freedom of citizens, but they most certainly need not respect any religion itself. Islam is not the holy cow among religions, nor should it be treated as one. Certainly not by liberal Democrats in Western countries. A still further claim is that the AfD sometimes says unpleasant things about Muslims. Yet mostly the AfD merely states statistical facts, well established by Germany's very own crime statistics, that other parties would prefer to sweep under the rug. Nonetheless, the agency, der Verfassungsschutz, would like to derive from the AfD's often harsh rhetoric an intention to grant Muslim citizens lesser rights than other citizens, although the AfD explicitly and categorically states that it intends no such thing. Besides, as long as the agency does not draw an equivalent conclusion in light of the decades-long raving of leftist parties against people on the right of the political spectrum, its inference seems to be an obvious case of selective prosecution, as it were. After all, the German Constitution prohibits state discrimination on the basis not only of religion, but also of political ideology. But of course, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution is apparently really not that interested in what the Constitution actually says. Orwell in Germany, defending democracy by outlawing the opposition. Moreover, on the left there are not only words, but discriminatory deeds. The already mentioned manipulative statistics that attribute anti-Semitic acts committed by Muslims to people on the right is a case in point. Moreover, the government supports online denunciation portals where concerned citizens can denounce anyone who dares to say, for example, that there are only two sexes or that trans women are men. Critics of such portals view them as a continuation of the former East German Stasi by other means. The Stasi, of course, was socialist East Germany's opposition persecuting secret service. These denunciation portals are manned by leftists and directed against opinions on the right. It is in effect a thought police, albeit one without executive powers. One can easily imagine what they would do with such powers. Even without them, they are already pernicious. And finally, in midst of a rising number of violent attacks on politicians, Nancy Faeser, the former Green-Red-Yellow government's Minister for the Interior, announced tough measures in defense of the democratic forces in our country. However, the term democratic forces in the mouths of leftist German politicians is a dog whistle for not the AfD. This was also noted by some commentators from liberal conservative quarters who accused Faeser, therefore, of implicitly legitimating violence against the right. Thus, in light of all this, the government's criticizing the AfD as undemocratic appears almost driven by an Orwell-esque slogan, outlawing the opposition is democracy. Björn Höcke, the bogeyman of the German left. What at last about Björn Höcke, the supposedly most extremist among prominent AfD politicians? Well, comparing his diabolical reputation with his actual statements is somewhat anticlimactic. While the left claims that his interview book demonstrates his intent to overthrow the liberal democratic basic order, they never show this. And most leftists who refer to this book in horror have clearly never read it. To be honest, I think they have quite generally read very, very little, but that's a different story. In any case, there is simply no hint of an anti-democratic design in Höcke's book. Now, the statement from the book that is almost compulsively being presented as decisive incriminating evidence is his assertion that a restrictive migration policy could not be implemented without some well-tempered cruelty. What is rarely noted in this context, however, is that this statement, with the same wording, was originally made by the world-renowned German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk. While the German left hates him, he has a nasty habit of pointing out facts that don't fit leftist narratives. It would be a remarkable leap to deduce from said assertion hostility towards the liberal democratic basic order. Incidentally, Sloterdijk dislikes the AfD. To be sure, the formulation well-tempered cruelty is indeed quite silly, but Sloterdijk's prose often prefers bombast to precision. But clearly, all that is meant is simply that restrictive immigration policies have to be sufficiently aversive and would inevitably come with collateral damage in the form of suffering on the side of would-be immigrants. This is at least honest on the part of both Sloterdijk and Höcke. Conversely, the German government never felt any need to acknowledge that unrestricted migration will come with collateral damage in the form of suffering of the German people, something that 15,000 rape and sexual assault victims could confirm. In fact, to the extent that crime of migrants are acknowledged by the government at all, this acknowledgement tends to take the form of blaming the victims, or at least German society. Maybe there's less bias and more humanity to be found in Höcke than in German government representatives. Nonetheless, several German newspapers have listed quotes from Höcke that are supposed to show just how evil he is. Yet again, this list does not quite fit the satanic hype. For instance, in the context of discussing the politics of remembrance, he infamously said that the German people is the only one that has planted a monument of ignominy, in German Schande, in the heart of their capital. He was interpreted by interested parties as thereby stating that the Holocaust memorial is ignominious. In fact, however, by the semantic and grammatical rules of the German language, the sentence says that the memorial is a reminder of the ignominy of the Holocaust and that other countries don't allow their ignominies to take central stage. Höcke has repeatedly clarified this, although it would not need clarification for a competent German speaker. Höcke has also been convicted of using an alleged Nazi slogan, namely "Everything for Germany." Höcke denied that he knew that it was prohibited. The slogan, after all, was certainly neither invented nor uniquely used by the Nazis. The judge, however, happily claimed that he must have known since he was a history teacher. Yet that it is common knowledge among history teachers that the phrase is prohibited is an assumption the judge made without plausibility and evidence, which is why some judicial experts deem the ruling to be politically motivated and unjust. Moreover, in Germany, so-called propaganda offenses are exclusively reserved for the right. But if you get convicted for everything for Germany, but not for all power to the Soviets or even all right-wingers into the Gulag, then this is not a sign of Höcke's right-wing illiberal tendencies, but rather one of Germany's left-wing ones, in particular as far as free speech is concerned. To give one final example of a quote supposed to reflect badly on Höcke, he stated that Angela Merkel's opening the borders was an, I quote, asylum political amok run. So evidently, he strongly disagrees with Merkel, as meanwhile does the larger part of Merkel's own party. He disagrees with a policy that overburdens Germany's municipalities, exploits taxpayers for the benefit of masses of foreigners, stresses the housing market to breaking point, leads to cultural changes the majority of Germans reject, and has produced more than 400 homicides and 15,000 rape or sexual assault victims. Gee, he must be a fascist. Oh, lest I forget. A few days ago, a German court enjoined the so-called Office for the Protection of the Constitution from calling the AfD a confirmed right-wing extremist party, due to the pathetically flimsy evidence provided by that agency. Yet many politicians of parties calling themselves democratic insisted, in spite of this ruling, on trying to prohibit the AfD anyway. Who would have thought, and who would seriously think, that these politicians are democratic?